And we're going to start by a little presentation to introduce to the non-musician audience what an Mbira is.
All right, so thank you all for joining us. I will go through a short presentation here, and then we will continue with questions to our guests, Anesu and Erica.
Yeah, feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A, which we're going to answer at the end of the program.
So, what is an Mbira? The specific Mbira we are discussing today is one called Mbira Zadvadzimu, and this is one inside of a calabash shell. And we'll talk about all of these bottle caps later on, as noise is an important aspect of this musical practice. So Mbira is the name of both the instrument and the music, is mystical music which has been played for over 1,000 years by certain tribes of the Shona people, a group which forms the vast majority of the population of Zimbabwe and extends into Mozambique. Mbira pervades all aspects of Shona traditional culture, both sacred and secular. Many types of Mbira exist, though the Mbira Zabadzimu, Mbira of the ancestor spirits, is of the Shona people of Zimbabwe and generally consists of 22 to 28 metal keys mounted on a hardwood soundboard called a guariva, made from wood of the Muvambaropa tree, and forgive me of pronunciation, an instrument in the lamellophone family, lamellophone or linguaphone, from the root lingua meaning tongue, a long thin plate fixed only at one end, and I found it interesting that the wood is of a healing tree, and the music is often considered a healing music. Medicines are made from this wood, I believe. So other lamellophones, the extended family of these instruments include the kushian, Jew's harp or jaw harp, many varieties you can find all over the world of instruments like this. And one important note, this is a kalimba, this is not an mbira. It is related, but it is quite different, not for beckoning the ancestral spirits. And these are called the deze. These are generally calabash shells. The mbiras are placed inside, which exacerbate their noise and sound, make them louder and resonate. So the most important function of the mbira is as a, quote, telephone to the spirits. It is used to contact both deceased ancestors and even more ancient tribal guardians at all-night mbira ceremonies. And we'll see a clip from one of these shortly. At these ceremonies, Vadzimu, including Midzimu, spirits of family ancestors, and Mahandoro Makombwe, spirits of the deceased chiefs and very, very ancient ancestors, who are the most powerful guardian spirits of the Shona, give guidance on family and community matters and exert power over weather and health. So when to use an mbira? To ask the spirits to bring rain during drought, stop rain during floods, bring clouds when crops are damaged by the sun, to chase away harmful spirits, and to heal both physical and mental illness with or without a nanga, traditional diviner herbalist, for personal meditation and personal prayers to the spirits, in celebrations of all kinds, including weddings, installations of new chiefs, and in modern times, government events such as international conferences, or for Shona kings and their diviners, at death ceremonies, or the Korova Guva ceremony, approximately 1 year after a person's physical death, to welcome the spirit back to the community. So I mentioned noise is a very important aspect of this music, and of course one that is traditionally shunned from Western music, at least when one is recording. I've heard attempts to remove the bottle caps as well, and you'll find various amounts of noise and shimmering depending on how many bottle caps adorn the instrument and the resonant gourd. So unlike Western music, which prefers to avoid noise, bottle caps, shells, or other objects known as machachara are often affixed to the soundboard of mbiras to create a buzzing sound when the instrument is played. And you can see two musicians playing Mbiras here. And we also have hosho shakers, and there are also leg shakers, which you hear in addition to all these buzzing bottle caps. So the Mbira is more of a medium than a piece of hardware, according to tinotenda.org, a wonderful resource. The buzzing bottle caps that adorn the instrument and its zeze serve to exacerbate the harmonic noise the instrument produces, increasing the volume of the instrument of the Mbira. The buzz is considered an essential part of the Mbira sound, required to clear the mind of thoughts and worries so that the music fills the consciousness of both musicians and listeners. The buzz adds depth and context to the clear tones of the Mbira keys, and sometimes may be heard as whispering voices, singing, tapping, knocking, wind, or rain. So I just have a short excerpt here that I hope is not too technical. It's a bit strange that one might compare or juxtapose the sound of an Mbira with a piano, and one term that it might be used incorrectly to describe an Mbira is a thumb piano. We do not call it a thumb piano. But for the sake of comparison, I chose to juxtapose a sound sample of an Mbira key from Erica's site next to a piano key. And before I even play this, you can see that there's a difference here in what we call the overtone structure. So a typical string instrument in the West, or a piano, has what we call more of a harmonic sound. And you can see that there's kind of an even distribution of overtones. But the Mbira is what we call an inharmonic sound. In addition to all of this extra noise, and there's a whole lot of extra noise in comparison to the piano, the overtone structure, you'll see, contains a couple of notes. There's a prominent low note and there's a prominent high note instead of this sort of even distribution here. So let me play this. So that gives you some idea of this complicated concept of harmonicity. So how to play? And you can see the bottle caps, and this looks like a fiberglass shell here, which are often used nowadays. In most cases, the numerous tones one hears in an Mbira performance are coming from only 3 fingers, with the 2 thumbs stroking down and the right forefinger stroking up. So now we're going to hear a couple of examples here. This is Tute Chikamba playing a composition. So as the video mentions in the beginning, this composition was adapted from another type of Mbira called an Njari. Maybe we can touch on that later. Here's another example, this time of two players, and we'll hear some vocalizations, which are a very important part of this music as well. Sadly, we lost Cosmas Magaya this past year. This is them in Zimfest 2007. So I'm going to play a portion of a Mbira ceremony here. This is a longer video just to get an idea of the dancing and other aspects that are involved. Might start a couple minutes in. I'm going to continue here. There we are. Okay, and to conclude shortly here. So this is an alternate system. This is one key layout that shows how the octaves are situated on an instrument that you can see has 23 keys. But what was very fascinating to me is that the instruments vary and their tuning systems actually vary. They were only named for the sake of Westerners who were asking for more details on these, as far as I understand. So unlike the Western musical notation system, the structure of Mbira music is similar to that of Shona singing. Musicians sometimes represent the three parts of their Mbira keyboard, each of which produces a different layer of Mbira music's texture, as old men's voices, young men's voices, and women's and children's voices. So the lowest keys here, the old men's voices, and then the middle voices on the upper left, and then the highest notes are on the right side. Perhaps one of the greatest resources is from Paul Berliner, who's written extensively, including 2 very new books. The Art of Mbira just came out, that, speaking of notation, has quite a lot of notations, but as we'll discuss, this music is learned through an oral tradition. And maybe most importantly, this music has no beginning or end, so we couldn't help but be reminded of Deleuze's concept of the rhizome. No part of the cycle of the piece is identified as the beginning by all musicians. You have the kushora, which is the leading part. In this musician, as we just heard in the Cosmos Magaya performance, this musician starts by playing his Mbira part at the point in the cycle that he hears at that moment. And after a few notes or cycles, then you have the following part, the kutsin hira player enters at the point in the cycle that they hear. Possibly a completely different point from the one where the kuchara player began, but they interlock, and the 2 parts are fixed and must be correct. The end of the performance may also be placed at any point in the cycle and can either be abrupt or fade out. So the collective heritage. To be a Gweni Mbira, a professional Mbira player accepted by the ancestor spirits to play at their ceremonies, is a role of service. When called at 3 a.m. to come play Mbira at a ceremony where other players have failed to bring the spirit called, the Gweni Mbira must go. Humility is required, as the Gweni Mbira is merely a tool of the spirits who enable him/her to play music for them. Ego about one's playing ability is not allowed. Such an insult to the spirits could result in the musician partially or completely losing the ability to play Mbira. And much of this info is from Erica's wonderful site. So I think that concludes my portion of the presentation here. I will now start by directing questions to both Anesu and Erica. Perhaps Anesu could start. So my first question has to do with improvisation. If you could discuss improvisation on the instrument. I understand that you learn by memorizing different key patterns, and that these can even be translated to different mbiras where they're often considered the same song. But how does improvisation factor in, and at what point are you good enough, I suppose, to explore improvisation, or does it begin from the very beginning? Anesu.
Thank you. I think that's a very kind of important question, but ultimately it's one of those things where it differs a lot between who is teaching you the instrument and also who's learning the music, because people pick up the different songs in kind of like radically different ways. People understand even the same song, or like hear the same song in very unique ways, which is part of the beauty of the instrument. Is it allows for you to hear the music and to play the music in all these different kinds of ways. Often most teachers tend to try and make you understand the core of the song, or at least the way they understand the core of the song first before moving on to improvisation. Because ultimately what's most important is being able to play cohesively with other players. I'm yet to meet someone who has learned to play the instrument solely for just playing for yourself and not to play with others. And often if there's an overemphasis of improvising as opposed to maybe teaching you how to play with others, you kind of run the risk of having a player learning how to play a song well, but then you get with other players and you can't really interlock those parts.
I see. Very interesting. Erica, would you like to add something with regard to improvisation? That was a very concise answer.
Sure. Really, this is one of those things that's starting to change because of all the Western students who are studying Mbira, including going to Zimbabwe and wanting to learn many different ways to play a song. But when I went in the 70s, and Western people coming to learn Mbira was not really a thing. I just learned the traditional way, and the traditional way is you just learn the way your teacher teaches you, and there's nothing like teaching you other ways. Mm-hmm. However, what I would say is that when somebody who's not a beginner is playing a traditional Mbira song, even when they think they're playing it the same way every cycle so that you as a beginner can learn, it's actually not the same every cycle, because what is the same to them and what is the same to you when you're learning are different. And there will be some notes that are changing every time. So as a student, you have to really sort of notice that and decide, okay, I'm going to learn this way, so that you have something to grab onto. Like, oh, he's doing sometimes this note in the upper octave and sometimes in the lower octave. I think I'll do it in the lower octave, and then you just try to keep learning until you get it. So really the traditional way of teaching you, there was no improvisation taught, and yet there was just a little bit that was, there's no really concept of improvisation. There's just the piece. Right. And the analogy I like to give is that, we come from a tradition of linear music, like it starts here and then it stops there. And so even when a Western person thinks about music that's in a cycle, you think, okay, there's this circle and then it goes around again. But what I would say is it's more like a sphere, and a sphere has infinite circles that are part of that sphere. But it doesn't mean it can just be something way out there. No, it's still part of that sphere, that song, that piece. So I
like that analogy very much for the harmonics.
So when someone's playing Mbira in the tradition, they're not thinking about, oh, I'm improvising. There's nothing like that. It's just the piece. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that when different things happen, it's not necessarily from you, because this is all about spirits. It's not about people. So if you find yourself, and I've had this happen to me where I found myself playing a way I'd never played before, and yet it was right in that piece. And this just happens with Mbira. It's kind of hard to explain because it doesn't really make any sense from a Western standpoint, but it makes a lot of sense within the Mbira tradition.
Absolutely.
And speaking of that, that different tradition and different lineage, Mbira music is often created collectively without emphasizing the authorship of individual artists. And that's a very selfless way to pass on a heritage. It's almost like Carl Jung's collective unconscious. And I find it fascinating as people these days just can't wait to put their names on everything and get their share. And what the West is trying to achieve with like community art or socialism is in fact just a norm in other cultures that don't really it doesn't get questions in Zimbabwe or other cultures. And what are your thoughts on this kind of collective authorship and collective ways of learning?
Ines, you want to jump in first?
Sure. I think that is a very important point that you just brought up, the idea that I think we are in this maybe time where a lot of people, at least it seems novel, right? The idea that you could have art that's owned in the commons, so to say. No one really owns the rights to one particular song or the layout of an instrument, which when you think about it within how music is produced and consumed within the Western world, is a little difficult to imagine that you could create a song and the song is just shared, it's played. I mean, to say that the music doesn't have an ownership is, how can I put this? The music belongs to the ancestors. They're the ones who own the music, and they're the ones for whom the music is being played. So the side of ownership is already in a different space. I mean, to even think of it as it's collectively owned by Zimbabweans would, in a way, kind of be a misrepresentation, I would say. But there is something there to be said. There's something to be said about the way that Zimbabweans think about what music is and what music's functions are. I mean, if we approach music from kind of this post-Enlightenment humanist approach, arts for art's sake, you create arts and then like maybe it's for the consumption of others or whatever. It's very different from, or at least it creates the possibility for creating and like selling music in a way that you really have to borrow kind of some concepts from sort of a Western standpoint to reach a point where you are taking this like music that's sacred to people and then you're able to kind of sort of create a commercial economy around it. That wouldn't necessarily be something that people would have done perhaps before. Sorry to Erica.
No, should I continue, or should Erica, would you like to comment on that, or Tansy, should I continue with the next question?
Well, I think Inesu covered it pretty well. It's like traditional Mbira music belongs to the ancestors, so there's already that ownership. And it was pretty interesting when I went the first time in 1974 to see how the commercial world dealt with that, because at that time, Mbira music was only sold as 45 RPM single vinyl. Wow. And so you could have so many records that were Nemam Sasa, but they were each called by something that somebody in that group sang that day when it was recorded, because the record industry couldn't really have all these records that were called Nemam Sasa. That wasn't just how they operated. So they would just make up what name to call it, not what the musicians called it, for purposes of, capitalism, basically, so they could sell it.
And for the unfamiliar, Nemam Sasa is probably the first song that you'll hear if you just type in Mbira music on YouTube. You'll hear this song maybe 90% of the time at first, unless you start digging deeper, and you'll hear this song called different names, right? And even played maybe on a different tuning and a different instrument. Perhaps it sounds very similar, but it's called a different name.
That was the song that Beulah Dioko and Cosmos Magaya played on your video.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes called Chipimbere, other names perhaps, I suppose. So
Chipembere is a different song, but then
That's a
you get
different
into
song.
the whole issue of naming, which the names of songs people don't agree about. So
Um,
And that
So-
reminds me of another part of the songs. Are the lyrics also a crucial part of Mbira music? Because I know that dance definitely is, because it is said that some of the Mbira players even adjust their tunes according to people's reactions, whether they are happy to dance to it or not. Is that true?
well, the way people play is going to be influenced by the context. If you're playing by yourself for your own meditation in the middle of the night, the way you play is going to be different than the way you play when you're playing in a ceremony or any context where people are dancing. And Mbira players will tell you, like, you don't want to play too slowly because you have to have the right tempo for people to dance. But if you're in a ceremony, you also don't want to play too fast because you don't want to tire them out when you want them to be dancing all night. So you need to have just the right tempo so that you can really energize people, keep them going, but not totally wear them out too quickly. So
what about the lyrics? Are they consistent, or are they
no, that is also supposed to be from the ancestors in the most traditional way. And I would say that's the thing that has been most changed by Western influence, first by church music and then pop music. So that, and also just the music industry and selling music. So there's much more of groups that will sing the same way every time. But when I went in the 70s, I mean, with a few exceptions, it's just the way people sang, it was completely different every time. And if you take, I guess I would say the musicians I know that are most oriented toward playing in ceremonies for ancient ancestors, the way they sing is never the same 2 times in a row. And I would say the only exception to that is there are some traditional vocal songs that are put to Mbira, and then it will still have that traditional song there. So those will stay the same. But mostly, I mean, let's take the example of Nimam Sasa that Ryan brought up. I can tell you that personally, when I have studied different ways to sing to Nimam Sasa with different musicians and then taught that to my students, I think I have about 8 completely different ways to sing to Nimam Sasa. Not just that what words or vocables you're using are different, but even where the melody fits in the Mbira music, completely different melodies. And so what I would just say is that Mbira music is very complex. And so the things that people are singing out of that complexity are pretty infinite, what they can be. But of course, like we were talking about the sphere, it still has to be in there. So, and when I'm teaching students to sing with Mbira, which I think is sort of interest, because it's like, how does that cultural cross happen for people to even have an idea how to do something in the way of a totally different culture that approaches music totally differently? And so what I start students doing is singing melodies, simple melodies that are within what they're actually playing on their instrument. But then when you go to how people really sing in Zimbabwe, imagine someone is singing out of not only what they're hearing in that moment from perhaps a group of musicians, but also every way they've ever heard that song in their whole lifetime. Right? That's all part of their experience of it. It's not just what their ears are hearing right in this moment. And so what they're singing to is to all of that. So I don't know. That's how I understand it. Maybe, Anisu, I don't know what you want to add to that.
No, in terms of, especially particularly with the issue of lyrics, it really does depend who is singing, what have they heard in their lifetimes, like you're saying. Where do they hear the melodies within the songs? What region of the country do they come from? What is happening within the ceremony itself? what occasion is being played. All of these things kind of collide such that like each time you play, it's a very different experience of not only the music you're playing, but also what you're singing to the music that you're playing. And then also kind of to factor in the issue that within a Mbira ceremony, the belief is that the words that you're going to sing are coming from the ancestors. So again, there is this aspect of, and this is maybe something perhaps that will come up later as we're talking, but we can't separate the changes that have happened to Mbira music without accounting for the changes that have happened to the society that the music is coming from. That with colonization, with missionization, with the change of the economy itself and how people relate to the music comes all these changes of what people are singing, how they're presenting the music, how they're explaining it to others. These are all kind of like deeply intertwined things, and which is kind of frustrating that like every question always begins with "it's complicated," but essentially that's it. We can always take this question sort of as a site to look at kind of how broad it kind of escalates really quickly. First we're talking about lyrics, but before you know it, we're talking about all these other things that affect what people are singing.
I'll also just mention something more specific about lyrics, since I know people are new to this, but there's a lot of traditional singing with Mbira that is not with words at all. So it's basically making music with your voice. Then there are some lyrics that are very ancient. In fact, they're so ancient that people in Zimbabwe can disagree about what they mean. And I say that from my experience, asking people what those lyrics mean, and then another person will interpret it differently. Then there are things where someone is praying to the ancestors right in that moment. You know, it's a drought and they're praying for rain and they're asking for rain. And then this was a nice example in the video you showed of Beulah Dioko and Cosmos Magaya, because at one point Beulah was making sounds that are specifically like dance steps, encouraging the dancers. I don't know if you remember some little rhythmic things that she did at one point.
That kind of
yeah.
rhythm. Yeah, we have all these wonderful.
So that's another thing that could happen, or somebody could sing something commenting on what's going on right in that moment. There's so many things, and then people could also sing things that are a comment on what's going on in general, you know, in the community or the country or the society, which can often be kind of hidden in symbolism so that it's not really straight out. And that was a huge thing during the Liberation War in Zimbabwe, where people would even record Mbira where they were singing things that were actually about the liberation struggle, but because it was couched in symbolism, there was no way you could say that it was that. And the colonialists were really not going to understand that that's what they were singing about at all. So
that's fascinating. Perhaps this is a good time to ask what happens if the ancestors are not beckoned at Mbira.
Are you asking what happens if you hold a Mbira and the ancestors don't come?
Yes.
Or if you don't hold the ceremony at all? No,
if you hold it and you are trying to get them to come and it's unsuccessful, what happens?
I had an experience of that. This was in 1994. And we ended up, the person I was traveling with and I ended up being invited to a ceremony where our friends were playing Mbira. And then at the end of the ceremony, there was someone who was there who was a spirit medium, but not the family spirit medium that was being called, was scolding this family. And later on, when people translated and explained this to me, basically the situation was this family had been trying to call their ancestor for 20 years without success. And I had seen that the spirit medium would start shaking a little bit, which is often what happens before a spirit enters somebody, but then it never all the way happened. And so this family was being scolded that because the family did not have unity with each other and that they had feuds within themselves, the ancestor did not want to come and help them. And that they needed to get their act together before this ancestor was going to be willing to deal with them. It kind of reminded me at the time, a parent of young children, that when your kids are fighting is not when you want to do something special with them, right? So it was almost like that. And so this person who was a spirit medium, I guess, was aware through his spirit of what the situation was, even though he didn't even know this family before. He just happened to be there. And so, but basically, you know, when you're talking about holding a ceremony, there is a purpose. And the purpose is, if you're a family, so that your family will have a good life and be taken care of. If it's a ceremony for an ancient ancestor, it's for something bigger, like to have rain so there won't be drought and you can grow food and there won't be starvation everywhere. So, you know, there's a purpose. So if you fail, that's not good. I don't know. Anissa, why don't you add to that? You probably can add much more than I can.
Oh, that's one of the, perhaps something to mention is the word Shona encompasses people who belong to very distinct cultures, very distinct lineages. And so how people will approach a spirit not coming among the Karanga might be different from how they do it among the Wakorekore or how they do it among the Wabujka. And it's one of the things where it's like each family has its own protocols, but also on a larger scale, each lineage or each clan might also have like their own protocols of what to do when those kinds of things happens. But that is what Erika is talking about, is one very classical issue, is if there's family in sort of like feuding, like amongst family members, it's a very, like, that's not an environment that you can expect the spirits to come over. And often when things like this happen, people will go and they'll consult Nganga, or they'll consult other people who might be able to point out what's happening within the family. Like, why is it that this illness keeps happening and we're trying to contact our ancestors, but we can't make that connection? So it's usually a symptom of an underlying issue that needs to be addressed before you can move forward within sort of the necessary processes that you need to do as a family.
I see. I'm curious, what is the earliest Mbira you can remember, Anistu?
That's an interesting question. I think probably I was 9 or 10. But also because I lived within an urban area, I didn't have as much opportunity to go to as many Mbiras as I would have liked. But it is a very different experience from family to family. And I emphasize that because the areas that I was able to go to were often being held by other families and not my own. And you could tell that, like, the way people are doing things in like these different families is like slightly different. But it's also because you are speaking to your ancestors, and these are very different from each other. So you can't expect everyone to be doing or to be approaching their elders within the same way. Each way of doing it has to be cognizant of what your particular ancestor is looking for and what might be considered, for example, respectful for one ancestor might be disrespectful for others. And you have to, and that's why, like, it's important to include your living elders within those processes, so they point out what you're supposed to do. It's not just an issue of we as the young people want to do this by ourselves and whenever we want to do it. there is usually very clear protocol of how things are supposed to be done. And so, yeah, it's slightly different from place to place.
And I've discovered through my research that, as an outsider, it could potentially be offensive, to ask some privileged personal information that might be akin to asking for a family recipe or something like that. Is that fairly consistent? Perhaps, I suppose it's such a personal kind of thing. It might even not be meaningful to an outsider should they be willing to reveal, personal information.
Yeah, like that's most certainly the case, that often, and often, perhaps I should begin by saying that within my own experiences, there tends to be a situation where when particularly people from the West come to Zimbabwe to ask these kinds of questions, it's usually in this like extractive way, in a way that's not really, it's like you're not trying to build a relationship with the people you're talking to. You ask questions, you know something, and then you go back where you've come from, and like maybe you write something and you publish it, maybe without even the consent of the people who, as they were sharing this information, didn't realize that that's what's going to happen. And so there's, of course, this issue, this like main concern of some knowledge is private, and that kind of privacy ought to be respected, but also that there is a precedent within the communities within Zimbabwe where we have the situation where there's an extraction of knowledge without consent, or at least a clear kind of like communication of what that knowledge is going to do. And so you end up having these situations where people become reluctant to share because you might share something very personal. I mean, there's often this sort of standoffish thing where someone says, oh, they told me that their ancestors did this, but these are people's family members you're talking about, and you're writing about people who people have a deep connection with, or you're reporting on things that people have a deep connection with. And so it's a very different experience, I think, for a lot of people, because they want, many people, at least I know, are willing to share, but there's always, it depends on the motivations behind asking those questions. It depends on the relationship that you have with the person who you're talking to. I mean, if you're asking someone you've known for 10 years versus someone you've just met on the day, it's very different, I think. I don't know if you might want to add something.
I think it's a huge issue, particularly in the academic world. This actually reminds me of an experience when I was at one of the only Society for Ethnomusicology conferences I've ever been to. This is many years ago. And I've forgotten this man's name, but there was a man who was presenting, who was one of the first people who made a lot of the recordings that were in the None Such Music of the World series. So some of the first world music recordings that were published in the US. And I was really happy that he was talking about how important it was to pay people that you record, so that you're not just extracting and using it for whatever you want, and then they're not getting anything. And he was saying, even if you're just doing it for your research and it's never going to be published, you have to pay them. And so some grad student is like, well, but what if your grant money isn't enough that you can pay the people that you're going to record? And he was like, then you don't record them. And I was like, yay. And I gave the example that when I was in Zimbabwe, I met someone who had been videoed in the 1960s. And this, I want to say it was about 10 years ago that I was at this meeting. And I said, I remember a musician I've met who was videoed in the 1960s by a professor who I will not name. And he's still waiting to be paid. And he talks about it like, I still haven't been paid yet. So-and-so, this professor so-and-so came and made this video of me and I haven't been paid yet. And this was like decades later. And there was still this like experience of how unfair it was. So there's also that side of it where, it's another side of the whole extraction. It's not just the information, but it's even just what value is being put on it. And he doesn't know that it's not being sold anywhere, but does that really matter either? When you're someone who comes from a more affluent society and you come and you do something with someone who is not at all affluent, that is helping you.
Right. Just because we're not dealing in minerals doesn't mean we shouldn't consider the same.
Exactly. So I think that's also really important.
Yeah. Great point. Did you have a last question or Tansy?
I have two questions actually.
Great.
And one of them is speaking of what's there and what's known by the Western or outside world. I've noticed that very few women musicians play the Mbira, or at least very few known by the outside world. Does that have to do with the gendered traditions, or is it a matter of who got recorded and heard?
I would almost say the opposite about who was recorded, because I would give the example of Stella Chiweshe, who was her recordings were more known in the Western world, so that people might have thought, oh, it's mostly played by women or something, whereas it is mostly played by men, which is changing more now. But there have always been a few women who played. One of my first teachers in 1974 told me that his grandmother had played. And he explained to me, because at the time I was really curious. I was a 20-year-old girl. I was like, are there any women around? And I did eventually. Actually, Beulah Joka was one of my first teachers, because I was looking for a woman. But my other teacher, who said his grandmother had played, he just pointed out that really in our culture, the spirits choose who plays Mbira. So if the spirits choose you to play Mbira, it doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man, you're going to have to play. And if you don't, you'll be sick, or all these bad things will happen. And eventually your family, when they go to find out what to do about that, is going to realize that, oh, you really need to do that. And they will, support you doing that. And so I'm curious to know what Anesu thinks about this, but personally, just from my experiences in Zimbabwe, I would just say that women in Zimbabwe work really hard. And so they don't have as much opportunity to sit down and play an instrument. And so I think that may have been the reason that, more men played Mbira historically. And I would also say that, of course, this is changing, with Western influences and urban culture and so forth. But I think in the village context, because it was mostly being played by men, even girls, and I've seen this happen, even girls who learned as children and played together with their family as children, then when they get married and they're a young, desirable young woman who's newly married, it's kind of like not appropriate, like a little bit indecent to be hanging out with the guys playing music when you're supposed to be doing all your womanly roles together with other women. So I don't know, that's how I've observed it, but I would really love to hear about that from Anesu, from inside the culture, how you see that.
Oh yeah, again, this is one of those questions that starts with it's complicated, because to understand why the trend of why there aren't as many women playing Mbira in Zimbabwe is probably many women would like to play Mbira, like many more women would probably like to play Mbira. There are all these layers of issues that kind of obstruct women's access to playing Mbira that men often don't face. Even as Mbira was within the context of colonization, as Mbira was being banned, or as Mbira there were actually laws being put into place to limit the kind of engagement that people had with spiritual practices or with traditional beliefs. There's first the constraints within Shona culture itself such as what Erica is alluding to this idea of once you become married, your family might not want you to play Mbira, and you're kind of forced to stop in order to please your in-laws. But then also Christian missionization comes in and creates a divide between what's acceptable for a good Christian woman and what's acceptable for a good Christian man to do. And then these things start compounding each other. You start having kind of a syncretism of patriarchies, to sort of put it in a very, and it's kind of disheartening when you think about it, that already there are all these like constraints before colonization and whatnot happens. And then as colonization happens, it only adds to that. It only adds a more complicated layer. And you end up having this situation where without access to not just Mbira music, but without access to education, you might not have the necessary capital to buy an instrument. Without access to sort of the social spaces needed to learn how to play the instrument, because people are sort of kind of expected to, like, you're not expected to hang out too much with people of like the opposite gender. You're now having a situation where you don't have access to that knowledge. So it's I feel like the question, is it a traditional, like, is there a reason within the tradition itself that stops women from playing Mbira? Would gloss over all these other complicated layers, such as access to wealth, access to education, social expectations about what you're supposed to do, and even the political arena shaping who is able to, who is even invited to play. And then add to that researchers coming in and expecting to interview men to get their perspective, even though there are players or women who are also there. And so men's voices keep getting more and more amplified, and it all kind of like, it just becomes a perfect storm that just presents so many more challenges. I mean, even within my own family, I mean, my sister faced a lot more resistance towards playing Mbira than I did. Even though my parents might consider themselves a little more progressive than perhaps their grandparents were, they were very hesitant to allow my sister to learn how to play. And it's things like that. It can be very discouraging that you want to pour your passion into something, but you're constantly meeting all of this resistance. Kind of meeting, there's already this layer of resistance within Zimbabwe itself, where people have these colonial era ideas that the music is somehow heathen and you're not supposed to play it. But then add to that even amongst the people who would be comfortable with listening to that music, they feel that you shouldn't play it because you're a woman. It becomes very complicated, I think, but yeah.
Thank you. I think that you explained it very well. And speaking of colonialism, there's another very complex question. What do you think about the new forms of Mbira music influenced by the West, like Tirikati's Mbira orchestra, because traditionally Mbira is not supposed to be played as within an orchestra, and Thomas Mapfumo, who brought it into the popular realm. And some might say that those influences are colonialism, but there's also like a philosopher, Juan Anthony Appiah, who wrote that cultures are made of continuities and changes, and the identity of a society can survive through these changes in societies. Without change authentic, they're just dead. But how do you balance between tradition and innovation, or those changes?
I don't know if I should begin.
Yeah, go ahead, Anesu.
Yeah, this question does come up a lot. And one thing that I try to challenge people to think about when asking the question about, can Mbira music can it survive outside its spiritual context? Can it be played outside its spiritual context? I think on the one hand, you have this kind of approach that we're talking about, that culture changes and we're supposed to embrace kind of like the changes that come with culture. And there's usually this real danger of downplaying like African ingenuity within the music scene by painting anything other than what we've decided is true tradition or is authentic tradition as deviant, and not recognizing that it's Africans using knowledge systems from other places to create something new. It becomes less of a question of, is this music that is being played now, how different is it from what was played back then, and therefore is it legitimate? Like it becomes less of a question of like time, kind of a temporal sort of anxiety over whether things are changing too fast. It becomes more of a question of how are people using different knowledge systems to create something new. But that said, on the other hand, by being too dismissive of sort of the rate at which the music itself is changing, we kind of risk a situation where we're looking at kind of the creation of like Mbira orchestra or like transferring Mbira to guitars and not, how can I put this? We need to be asking ourselves what is being sacrificed about the music in the process of those changes. And on whose terms are those changes being made? Because if we're changing things because we want to be more palatable to a Eurocentric idea of what music should be, then that's a very different thing from taking what you already have and creating something new with it. One comes from a place of trying to expand the music that you have, and another comes from trying to kind of co-opt the music so it's more palatable to a non-Zimbabwean audience, so that it's more, it's mimicry. It ends up being kind of like mimicking what other people are doing and less about moving or adding rather to the music that you already have. If the existence of Mbira on guitars or the Mbira orchestra is being done in a way that doesn't erase the existence of the spiritual significance of the music that we have, it's very different than saying we want to erase the spirituality of the music for the sake of creating this new thing. I don't know if that distinction makes any sense, but it's, I think, depending on, it's much less, is it good to innovate with Mbira music as much as it is, why do we feel that those innovations are necessary? Like, what are we trying to achieve? What's the end goal? Are we doing it because we want to expand the kind of music that we play for our enjoyment, for our own edification? Or are we doing it because we are sort of assimilating into ideas about what music should sound like, and we're kind of erasing our own aesthetics in the process?
I think you probably find both. But, you know, I haven't personally had this discussion with any of the musicians who both play in Mbira orchestras and play the traditional way at ceremonies separately. But I know people who have discussed that with a couple of musicians who said that, oh, well, I do that other thing for money because I can make money going and, you know, playing with the Mbira orchestra at the hotel. Or I think probably some of them the same thing about playing in Mbira in an electric band where you can go and make money doing that. But it doesn't mean they're not still, some of them, able to go and play the traditional way in a ceremony when you know their family has a ceremony or their friend's family has a ceremony or whatever. So I think it's a little hard to untangle exactly, but definitely the financial part is in there too, about what people can make money doing, and then why is that? So somebody is deciding that that is what's going to bring the audience or something. And who is that? And I don't know the answer because I really haven't studied that at all. But I think that's such an important point, Anesu, that, you know, are people doing it because they're wanting to do it or because they're trying to do it to please someone from outside the culture. But I don't know, the way I see it, just having been involved in this music for so many decades now, is that it seems like there has consistently been both people playing the traditional way for the ancestors, which I would say that being defined in the more cultural sense as being able to play in a way that brings ancestor spirits. Because that's how I think of the word, not as any specific way of playing, because there's so many ways to play. But if you can play in a way that brings the spirits, that's what I personally think of as traditional. And I've heard from other people who were there when some of these Mbira orchestras came to play at a ceremony and no spirits showed up. And then some other musicians played and the spirits came. But then at the same time, when I first went in the 70s, you know, there were people who played reggae on their Mbira in the city. So I think that thing of just like experimenting and mixing things and doing things in a way that you wouldn't play in a ceremony, but, you know, taking your favorite current Roomba song at the time and putting that on Mbira. People were doing that also in the 70s. So I think these different things where people try out different things that are in their environment and mixing that with the instrument, I think that has probably been happening as long as there were cultural meetings of any kind. And I would give the example of, we didn't talk about what is Njari, that Tute Chigamba was playing a song that, if I recall correctly, one of his relatives, I think it was his uncle, played Njari. And so he knew that song from his childhood, and then he put it to the type of Mbira that he plays. But Njari, as far as I understand, and it's hard to be sure about these things that are centuries ago, but that it had been brought from Mozambique into Zimbabwe about 400 years ago. And then the community that it came into retuned it to make it go with the local music and started playing the local music on it. And then it became, you know, an instrument in Zimbabwe. So, you know, when different people meet, things are going to happen, you know, and things are going to combine. That will always be part of, I think, different groups of human beings encountering each other. And then you have this other side of it with Mbira, where if you're going to get ancestors to come, what is going to bring them and what isn't? And I would imagine that would change over time if you were talking about a family ancestor, because somebody's favorite music who's alive today, later on when they're an ancestor, might be different than the favorite music of an ancestor from long ago that you're trying to call today. So that's just sort of an interesting thing to imagine for me, because even in ancestorhood, if you're going to play for an ancestor that's hundreds or thousands of years old, obviously that is going to have to be a really old way of playing to please that ancestor. But if it's an ancestor who isn't that long ago, what might please them might be different. And I think of the song Chamtengure because of that, because that song has only been around for maybe 100 years or a little more. So I don't imagine that if you were playing for an ancestor from 500 years ago, that song would really be something that they're going to be interested in. But if you're playing for an ancestor from 50 years ago, maybe they really liked that song during their lifetime, because I do know people who play that song in ceremonies. So to me, that just gives an interesting way to look at that continuity of time. That is not just the continuity of time of the living people, but even of the ancestors.
Seems very much a living instrument. The fluctuations that occur with the tuning due to humidity and temperature and all these things being accepted rather than rejected. You know, where a violinist retunes their instrument to the same A440, it's not exactly the same for an Mbira player. And I find that very fascinating, and it means that the music is much more complex in its microtonality, and it's very beautiful for that reason.
Ryan, you would love this. I know one musician who, when he gets a loose key and it's making this twanking noise, he'll work that into how he's playing and make that key make its own rhythm, like you're having this other percussion instrument playing along with you, because that key is like actually loose, and like usually you would just want to like stop and tighten that key. No, he'll keep playing and make that part of what he's doing.
Wonderful.
Kind of amazing.
You'll have to send me that.
when you were saying that, I just thought, oh, Ryan, I would like that.
Yeah. The diversity in performances, once again, of what are purportedly the same song. There's a wonderful diversity. They all sound so uniquely different, and sometimes have some really incredible things like you just described.
And if anybody is really interested in hearing examples of that, at the Mbira.org website, there's something that we call Mbira Piece Intensive Listening. And there'll be 80 minutes of different recordings of the same piece. And in fact, the Nemam Sasa one was all recorded during the same month of the same year. It was 2003. But the others often have from many different years. But you can hear many different individuals, duets, and groups playing the song in different ways. And it's a really great way to start to get a sense of that sphere instead of the circle.
And speaking of that, I'm going to start to ask questions for the audience, because one of them, Amir, actually asked, can you recommend an artist or an album that I can listen to that focuses in this type of music genre? What's a good album for beginners?
Go to Mbira.org and audio recordings, and you can listen to audio samples of any of them and find what you like. Because there are hundreds of Mbira albums there, and they're all good.
Of course. Oh, and Erica, Benton asked you if he's a visual artist, so he asks if your fabrics are also from the Shona people?
Yes. Yes, you can't get this anymore, but many years ago, I got this fabric in Zimbabwe. And it actually has the Zimbabwe bird in the design, which is on the flag of Zimbabwe. And these are like clay pots,
Michael
like traditional beers brewed in.
Great. Another question. What directions are they comfortable with and without? This audience is interested in the panelists' view on how and where Westerners outside the tradition have taken Mbira performance. I think that was similar to our last question of the directions that the music might take with outside influences. Patrick asked, what was the name of that early world music complication that you referred to earlier? Which part? We can, by the way, we can also answer questions by emails if you guys have anything that you want to ask later.
And the recording should be available to
check. Stefan asked best places to learn Mbira. I think from you guys, of course, because Erica also teaches, and Mbira.com. I'm going to type that in.
.org. Mbira.org. Okay. Not .com is a tech company. Mbira.org. I don't know why it is, but Mbira.org.
Cool.
Yeah, I teach over Skype, so I can teach people anywhere in the world.
That's great.
And people can source the instruments also at Mbira.org, and we ship all over the world for 16 Zimbabwean Mbira makers.
Wow.
That's amazing. So if, Mbira asked any Mbira live concerts coming up, even if virtually?
Not that I know of.
We hope that there are going to be more live
But
concerts.
I also encourage people to go to YouTube, to Mbira, the nonprofit, and you can experience many videos that I've made of Mbira being played by various people in Zimbabwe.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I want to thank Erica and Sue for joining us today, and thank Residency Unlimited, Natalie and Lulu for hosting this. And yeah.
Thank you very much. Both of your responses were very deep and thoughtful, and we very much appreciate it.
Oh, thank you to both of you for making it happen.
Sorry to, I believe there's one last question within the chat, and I think it was a clarification.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Do you see it, Tang?
Talked about a Zimbabwean being influenced from outside. What do you think of what Westerners have done with it? That's the question. I think he meant, what do you think Westerners have done to influence the music from the outside? Is that the question?
Well,
they might be asking about Westerners who are using the instrument outside the culture. I don't know.
Oh, yes, he says yes.
Oh, okay. Do you want to address that, Agnesu?
Yeah, I think the question is less about, well, first of all, I think the issue with what happens with Mbira music after it leaves Zimbabwe, when it's now, perhaps it's in the United States or it's in Japan or France or wherever, it's a very important question, because how people play the music and how people relate to it within those circles is very, in many ways, it's very different from how Zimbabweans, like the relationship that Zimbabweans have with the instrument itself. The instrument starts to get very, well, we start talking about it as an instrument and not as we were talking about at the very beginning, as a telephone. It takes up completely new and different meanings to what people have. And I think like what even complicates this question further is the fact that after the music is now being played, whether people are playing it within groups or ensembles, you begin to have people start to modify the instrument. I've seen people do this quite a lot, where people are like, well, what if I make it chromatic? What if I tweak this? What if I tweak that? And from the discussions that I've had with other Zimbabweans, it's kind of one of those things that a lot of people are kind of saddened by, because it's like the first, on kind of like a base level, it's not somewhat disrespectful. It's a kind of an overt dismissal of whatever sort of like aspects of the music that exist for Zimbabweans, and it's saying you can take the instrument, you can do all these other things with it. And to be honest, a lot of Zimbabweans are kind of divided about this. Some Zimbabweans view that as it's like a good thing. It's innovative. It's opening up the instrument to the rest of the world. It's making people know more about us. But other Zimbabweans are not so welcoming to those changes, because it's telling that you approach a culture and you say you want to learn from it, and the first thing you do is start changing things about it. And Zimbabweans have been experiencing sort of the West changing things about themselves since colonization began. It's something that we're intimately familiar with. It's not something new. And I think making that connection, that those kinds of changes, or people need to ask themselves why they're changing things, I think, more than anything else, as opposed to just things are changing. It's like, why is it necessary to do that? And from what perspective or from what angle is someone approaching deciding to change things? It's one of those things where it's like, for every case you meet, someone has a very different approach to what they're doing, and but it's kind of a divisive question amongst Zimbabweans themselves. I think even right now, a lot of people don't quite agree on what to even think about this.
With regard to change, I recall one of the numerous humorous anecdotes in the Berliner book. He was asking an older Mbira player about the change from using shells, seashells, to adorn the instrument to bottle caps. And the older Mbira player thought for a second, and he said, well, our ancestors used shells because they couldn't get bottle caps yet. So,
I mean, what I think about this issue is that within Zimbabwe, if people want to change things, that's from within their own culture. They want to mix something with something, or whatever they want to do. But once you're somebody who's not only outside that culture, but in a position of relative privilege, when you start trying to change it, that's cultural appropriation. You're doing it for your own purposes because, not only you're dismissing it, as Anessa was mentioning, so that's already disrespectful, but then you're just like using it for whatever you want, which is, I don't know, to me, that's what I think of as cultural appropriation, because it's like you're using it for your own purposes. And, I think there's a difference between people outside the culture who want to learn it and respect the culture and support the people in the culture who are, who are the home of the music and the instrument. But I mean, if you think about it, in the cultural context, it is a sacred instrument. And so for people from outside the culture to just take it like, it's just like my guitar, I can just like change the strings up and tune it differently or whatever, it's just sort of missing the point that this is somebody else's sacred instrument and that you are choosing to do that. And I think where that gets really complicated, and I've run into this where people choose to do totally different kinds of music or sing their own English song about something totally different together with a traditional Mbira, while they're playing a traditional Mbira song. Where this gets very tricky is that within Shona culture, people are very polite. And so if you go and ask your teacher, how do you like this? And then you do your new fangled thing that you've come up with. They might just say, oh yeah, that's fine, because they don't want to offend you, but it's not necessarily what they really think. And I once really had a problem with somebody about that, because then that same person later on told me that they really didn't like that. But of course, their other student just didn't know because they'd asked their teacher and the teacher didn't tell them, no, this isn't okay. I would say that Shona culture is much more subtle than particularly American culture. We're very out there, but Shona culture is where, you didn't serve the person something to drink means you don't want them to come back. But to an American, you wouldn't notice that anything happened, right? So the culture is very polite and very subtle compared to what Americans are used to. So miscommunication can really easily happen. And so that just makes it even more difficult for somebody who wants to do something that they're not sure if it's okay. It makes it even more difficult for them to find out, what people think. And as Anessa said, people are going to disagree. Some people are going to think that's fine, and some people are going to be like, no, that's really not okay.
Thank you. So that's just our little attempt to decolonize. Yeah, Lulu?
Is Lulu there? There she is.
Oh, Emir asked if there's a Middle Eastern influence to the Mbira.
Well,
Zimbabwe is very, very far away from the Middle East.
and maybe we didn't mention it's over 1,000 years old. Maybe you each have a better number, but it's a very, very old instrument.
Mm-hmm.
It could be several thousand years old. You know, when I asked people in Zimbabwe many years ago, they said that, you know, it was thousands, plural, of years old. But then at the time, all the archaeologists were saying that metal had only been made in that part of the world for 1,000 years. So that's why I always put over 1,000 years. But now they say metal has been around for 3,000 years in that, you know, region of the world. So pretty difficult to know how old Mbira is. I would just say very old.
Thank you. So our time is up. So I guess that's it for this afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again, Anasu and Erica, and Residency
Thank you,
Unlimited.
Tansy and Ryan.
Thank you.